I hear you when you say that you just want to get back to the things you love, not worry about this pandemic or about an election. That you just want to know that your members of Parliament of all stripes will have your back through this crisis and beyond. The moment we face demands real, important change. And you have given this Parliament and this government clear direction.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Globe and Mail's post-election chat. I'm Laura Stone. I'm a Queen's Park reporter for the Globe, and I'm joined by my colleague, Campbell Clark, who's the Globe's chief political writer. He's based in Ottawa, but today he's joining us from Montreal because he was at the Liberal victory party last night. Thank you so much to everyone for joining. I would like to say that we'll be taking questions today. I'm very happy to say that. So please submit them. You can post your comments in the chat, but we ask that you please be civil, no trolling, no obscenities or abuse or false information. And that's not why we're here. And if that's posted, you'll be restricted on the stream. So thank you so much again. And please send us your questions. We'd love to hear from you and what you thought of the election. So Campbell, let's start with everyone waking up this morning. Maybe they didn't stay up till 2 or 3 a.m. like you and I. What the heck happened last night with Canada's election?
It turns out we ended up pretty much like we began, or like it was 2019, and not alone, even though it seems like we're back in the same spot. It's kind of a remarkable thing. We've been through a pandemic. We've been through a lot of change in this country, and somehow the political picture didn't change at all at the end.
And so what is the impact of that? I mean, nothing changed, but a lot changed, right? Because this is certainly not what the major parties heading into this campaign were anticipating or had hoped for. Yeah.
So I think nobody got what they'd hoped for here. This is the first election campaign where everybody lost somehow. But aside from the results being the same as they were pretty much the same as they were in 2019, we've been through something now. And the process, changes the way we're going to have to deal with politics coming up. So there's going to be a bit of a stalemate period now, and there's going to be some difficulty in terms of moving things forward for the government, not right now, but later on. So look at what we saw in that clip that Justin Trudeau, in Justin Trudeau's speech last night. He was saying, what you say when you're reduced to a minority or when you have a minority government or when the election doesn't turn out the way you want, you say, I hear you, I heard you, I've learned the lessons of these results, I've been chastened. But it's pretty unusual that the lesson is I shouldn't have called this election. And so now we have sort of a built-in mistrust of Justin Trudeau's motives, of a limiting factor on what he can do. He can't really threaten to call an election. Probably for the rest of this government. And for quite a period of time, he's going to have to figure out how to run his minority government. Now, the good thing for him is that every other party can't really move to an election. We're in a bit of a stalemate. They can't really demand everything they want because they can't threaten to force an election. So for a period of time, Justin Trudeau will govern, but he's weakened by this.
Looking at the results from last night where the Liberals kept seats or maybe picked some up, why do you think they weren't able to secure the majority that they had hoped for heading into the campaign?
Yeah, there's two reasons, I think, that are fairly clear. I mean, obviously, the first one is that the first couple of weeks of the campaign revolved around mistrust of the whole idea of an election, and the Liberals failed to launch. So, I mean, just that lack of momentum meant that their whole national campaign was slower than they'd hoped for. But then there were some regional reasons. In Quebec, there was kind of the opposite picture for the campaign. It actually went well for the Liberals in Quebec in the first half, and they thought they were going to gain 5 or 6 or 7 seats in Quebec until the English debate, when a question was posed about Bill 21 to the Bloc leader, François Blanchet, and he viewed that as offensive. It was seen as offensive in Quebec. It made a lot of Quebecers angry, and that really gave the Bloc momentum, and that knocked back the Liberals. And then in English Canada, in Ontario, they lost a few seats. They had to keep those seats. They had to do better really, to get the majority. And they essentially, never really took off.
And what happened to the Conservatives? They essentially have come out of this with more or less the same number of seats that they had going in. They picked up some seats in Atlantic Canada, lost some support out west. But clearly the big hope for Aaron O'Toole was Ontario and the Greater Toronto area, and he was unable to break through there. Quebec as well. We saw him speaking about Quebec a lot during the campaign. So what do you think happened there that he was unable to rise above the ceiling that the Conservatives currently have?
Yeah, first of all, let's go back a couple of months. And, 2 months ago, this would have been something people would have said, oh, that's pretty good for Aaron O'Toole, because it was not looking good for him again. But what happened was he ran a good half a campaign. Aaron O'Toole had a really good first 2 weeks, and then he stalled basically with the question of banning assault-style weapons. He had in his platform a policy that he would lift the ban on a list of semi-automatic weapons. And when he started getting questions about that, it kind of stalled his momentum. People were asking about it. He spent 3 or 4 days fielding those questions and finally amended his platform. And that actually was kind of a check on his momentum. I think then the questions started setting in for Aaron O'Toole. And if you watch, after those first couple of weeks, he didn't really have something to pivot to that would drive his campaign to start over again. So I think essentially what happened was an atavistic return to the status quo in a lot of those ridings, because people who were unsure about Justin Trudeau's motives then were pretty unsure about who Aaron O'Toole was.
Right. So do you think that he is more vulnerable coming out of this campaign than Justin Trudeau, who, we saw 2 cabinet ministers last night lose their seats. He did not get this majority. He's now, as you said, kind of weakened. Who do you think will be facing the most kind of internal strife within their own party coming out of this?
Yeah, I think it's going to be Aaron O'Toole. Justin Trudeau has made the Liberal Party his own, and for all the second guessing there will be, and there should be really, because this was a gamble that he didn't win. Aaron O'Toole's got another problem. Aaron O'Toole's party isn't always thinking about, are we going to win the next election? They're also thinking about, was this the person representing the conservatism I believe in? And Aaron O'Toole has a big problem in that he ran as a leadership campaign one way. There was people already unhappy with him that he moved the party in a different direction for this election campaign. He was running right up to the last days on "This is not your father's Conservative Party," and this is a more progressive, more moderate, more middle ground Conservative Party, and that wasn't necessarily where his party had agreed to go. There's going to be a lot of people inside his own party who are going to be fighting. That seems to be the conservative tradition, or it's becoming a conservative tradition, that on election night, the first thing you do is, if you lose, is say, here I am running for the leadership again.
Yes, let's talk about his speech, because he brought up his concession speech. He brought up numerous times the fact that there could be another election in 18 months. We'd heard Mr. Trudeau talk about that in a debate, that the average length of a minority government is 18 months to 2 years. So what do you think Mr. O'Toole was signaling there? Who do you think he was talking to in that speech when he said, there could be another election shortly and I'm the guy to lead you into it?
Yeah. So, well, as well as I, that the first thing people were thinking of at 1 o'clock in the morning I guess it was this morning, wasn't let's go into another election campaign. That was him riling up his own party. That was him, auditioning to keep his own job. That's also what Andrew Scheer did in 2019, as you'll remember. He did that. He did a similar thing on election night, and it was a bit interesting that he was more fire in the belly after the results came in than he was for the 3 days before. And I think, clearly he was trying to galvanize some support. He also said twice that he would lead the party into the next election. And it was funny that he kept talking about Justin Trudeau wants to bring us to another election. He'll be bringing us to another election in 18 months. But clearly, Justin Trudeau is the one leader who can't be talking about an election for a good long time. And Aaron O'Toole is the leader that has to.
And why is that? Because just Trudeau has played his cards on this, and it's up to the opposition? Played his cards.
I mean, can you imagine Trudeau not calling another election without being defeated by the opposition in 18 months' time? It would be I mean, you would think it would be politically like putting your head in a wood chipper, was Aaron O'Toole. He has to keep the idea of an imminent election live. He has to keep the idea that they're still in a fight for the next round going, and he literally has to campaign inside his own party right away.
But we have a couple of audience questions, and before we get to those, I just want to recap what happened with the other parties. So the NDP, maybe gained 1 or 2 seats depending on how the mail-in ballots go, and some results are still trickling in. But what do you make of that party's performance? And then we can talk too about the Greens and the People's Party, which also had some kind of interesting results for their leaders, certainly.
Honestly, I'm a little bit surprised. I don't know how you feel, Laura. I'm a little bit surprised that the NDP wasn't a bit stronger last night. I mean, if you saw the polls, right up to the end, they were 21% in the polls. And I really thought that this time might be, the campaign where they didn't sort of fade in the stretch. That typically happens to the NDP. The Liberals' last week campaign usually revolves around some variation of vote for the NDP because you'll elect the Conservatives, and to a certain extent that works. And I think there was that part of it. I also think Jagmeet Singh ran what looked like a really interesting youth campaign or youth targeted campaign. You saw him on TikTok a lot. He was really good at social media. He apparently rides a skateboard, and I think it really did have some value in sort of connecting to younger voters, but they don't vote as much as other people still. And in a low turnout election, I'm guessing when we see how the turnout broke down, it wasn't a lot of young voters.
Do you think that there's any risk at all to Mr. Singh's leadership, or do you think that he held the party steady and you don't really see any kind of push from the inside to remove him?
Yeah, I don't think there will be. I think there's be a little bit of disappointment that it didn't turn out, because I actually think they ran a pretty shrewd campaign, and yet they didn't get the results. But the one thing that Mr. Singh has going for him is that he does have a high likability factor, and people rate him more highly than any other leaders. I can't see that the New Democrats have a contender sitting around with that kind of, baked-in likability that the public wants to see them succeed, and that's a pretty big thing for a third party, a fourth party, I guess they are. To be able to boast a leader that people generally like, they've got that willingness to, hear from them. That's a big thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting that the Tories don't give their leaders the benefit of the doubt like that. So just quickly, Greens and People's Party, both Annamie Paul and Maxime Bernier did not succeed in their bids to win a seat in Parliament. But who do you think came out on top in sort of the battle of the smaller parties?
Well, this was another area where it's hard to say there was success for either. The People's Party, did see a stronger popular vote, but nothing that, they didn't win a seat. Maxime Bernier didn't win his own seat. And that there was, I think, at certain points in this campaign, polls that suggested that maybe there'd be some pretty large groundswells for the PPC, possibly in Ontario. But 5% overall, that wasn't the 7, 8, 9% that people thought they might end up with. I think probably there was some issue of, this is a protest, but not necessarily an electoral protest where all the people that like the PPC went out and turned out at the polls. As for the Green Party, well, before the campaign, that party was internally divided and a bit of a mess. And after the campaign, that party is going to be internally divided and a bit of a mess.
Do you think that Annamie Paul survives? Do you think she's going to be the leader by December?
I can't think that she wants to be the leader by December anymore. I mean, that party, not to recap all of the internal divisions in the party, but there was, lawyers involved. There was essentially a situation where the leader was saying, vote for me as leader of the Green Party that wants to get rid of me as leader. And that's
not funny, but it's just so bizarre, right?
It's very bizarre. I mean, you can't imagine that happening, especially just weeks and months before an election in any other party in Canada. And I think they've got a lot of things to work out about their identity. I don't think Annamie Paul is going to be sticking around to do it.
Okay, let's get to some questions here. We have a couple. So the first one is about electoral reform. They say, living in Alberta, I watched the election coverage unfold last night, and it seems as though the farther west you go, the less your vote has an impact. Would a more representational system really change this? Is there more to be done for regional inclusion in the outcome? I actually find this an interesting question because I feel like we did see some breakthroughs in conservative country in Alberta where, sure, of course, the broad majority were conservatives who won their seats, but we saw the NDP pick up a seat. I believe we see at least one Liberal, maybe two. I have to check the latest results and the mail-ins, but that to me shows a weakened conservative party. But I understand I understand the viewpoint of people living in Alberta thinking that it's just going to be conservative sweep across the board, and it generally is. So what's your view, Campbell, on this idea of electoral reform, whether it's ranked ballots or proportional representation that could potentially change the outcome of the election in the West?
Well, I'm never sure what I think about proportional representation. I'll tell you why. There's two things about it that conflict with me. One is democracy is always kind of a compromise, and people have to make compromise choices. And to a certain extent, I'd rather see people do it at the ballot box, picking their compromise choice, rather than parties getting together, a bunch of parties getting together, and compromising behind closed doors and making those deals. Now we're going to get that in a minority parliament anyway, but probably not to the extent we would get if we had a more fragmented system. Don't get mad at me if you're a PR person. I know that's not what you want to hear, but I do wonder about that. On the other hand, the point that the questioner makes here is the biggest thing PR has going for it, which is in any area, there is this feeling that if you are in an area where there's an overwhelming conservative majority, an overwhelming liberal majority, but still 30% of you feel, I want to go out and vote for X party anyway. Your vote doesn't count. You're not represented because of where you live. And proportional representation does offer a way to remedy that. Those two things are in conflict.
Hey, maybe that'll happen in this minority parliament. Maybe we'll finally see electoral reform from the Liberals.
I don't think so. And I mean, the thing about it is, the People's Party is now part of the proportional representation conversation.
Right.
Do people, and that will be one of the things you'll hear people say, do you really want 6% of the seats going to the People's Party?
Just before we move on to the next question, just in looking at Alberta, why do you think the Liberals were able to break through again, albeit in very small numbers? But do you think that do you think this is tied to Premier Kenney, the struggles he's having with COVID in the province, the strength of the opposition NDP, the way that Trudeau brought Kenney and Moe into the campaign? What do you think happened there that the NDP and Liberals were able to break through somewhat?
Yeah, two things. One is this is an urban thing mainly, right? In Calgary and Edmonton, there are some fairly, I don't know if I'd call them left-wing communities, but it's not the same as small town in rural Alberta. But secondly, there has been an impact of the United Conservative Party's disunited approach to the pandemic and the disappointment with Jason Kenney. I think that's got a mark on the blue brand, if you will. That probably helped. Randy Boissonnault in Edmonton, he didn't lose by that much in 2019. The Liberals had won Calgary Skyview before. Those are the breakthrough ridings if there's going to be a breakthrough, and the margins weren't that off. I do think that the pandemic performance of Jason Kenney had a big impact.
Let's move on to the second question we have here. So it says, now that the Liberals have another minority government, what can be done to address the crisis of affordable housing? So this was one of the issues that came up at the campaign. We heard all the parties talk about it, but I would say that the election, certainly in the last week or two, sort of devolved from any discussion of policy or issues to a very political message from the leaders, very much kind of personally going after each other and trying to win over voters in terms of strategy as opposed to policy.
Yeah.
I think I think now within a minority situation with the Liberals potentially now having to work with the NDP again, I think this will come up, and I do think that they're going to have to incorporate some of what the NDP was proposing. Campbell, what are your thoughts on where this could go, this issue could go?
Yeah, so that was an election issue that we didn't see as much on as you said, on the national scale, but it was in the downtowns a big deal. You know, in Montreal, for example, the NDP was pushing that pretty hard in urban ridings where they're in competition with the Bloc and the Liberals. In Toronto and Vancouver, that was a much stronger issue than you heard, you know, from the touring leaders on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, I think that's one area where the Liberals and the NDP will, you know, be able to come to some form of compromise, because it's in the Liberals' best interest to be seen to be doing something more on housing. And there's the two sides of that housing issue that people talk about, right? One is the, can I afford a house in suburban Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, and the other is housing in cities where people are trying to get affordable rents or affordable apartments. They're not quite the same issue. It's probably easier for the Liberals to work on the urban issue with the NDP than the other issues.
I think we heard during the campaign too, the message, certainly from the Liberals, that there's kind of no silver bullet to this issue. They talked about a flipping tax, or if you sell your house within a year, you'll get taxed, and the Conservatives, tried to kind of lean onto that as a tax on all your homes.
Yeah.
There was a debate there about the accuracy of that statement, but what do you think? What do you think the Liberals, on the topic of affordable housing, what do you think the Liberals' first move on this would be? Like, what do you think is something that they can do to at least get the ball rolling on, I think, just the issue of home ownership, particularly in the Toronto area, Vancouver?
Yeah, I don't think there is I think there's a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't policy problem with house prices. If you help people buy houses, that stimulates demand, and prices don't go down, they go up. And that is the conundrum that policymakers are trying to deal with. It's hard to sort of build more houses or build more supply of houses in a way that actually has an effect on things. So I think the flipping tax, for example, was a symbolic measure that the Liberals put out there to get everybody's attention, say, hey, we're doing something here.
Right.
I think they'll probably move forward that quickly. I don't think it's going to have a big impact.
So back to some of your comments off the top about how the parties will now have to work together, and maybe some of the Liberals' upper hand on this issue might now not be as not as high, maybe a little bit lower, because now they're chastened a bit by this election call. How do you see Parliament working, and do you see the Liberals working more with the Bloc on some issues, the NDP on others? Who do you see as their natural allies?
So to answer your last question first, the NDP is their natural ally, I think, in most things. And when I said I think they're going to lose some leverage, I think that's not necessarily a right-of-way problem. In other words, I think that's going to be as time goes on. But you think about the way the last Parliament was going in its sort of latter months, and the problems the Liberals were having weren't really that they couldn't get their agenda across. It was that the opposition was teaming up to do things that made them uncomfortable. Show us the intelligence on that Winnipeg lab, or things that they didn't really want to. The Parliament was making demands of the government for information, holding investigations. That kind of thing can be really uncomfortable, will be really uncomfortable for the Liberal government, because other parties have a lot of opportunity to sort of, needle the Liberals in various ways as they govern. One thing I'm not sure about yet is how aggressive the Bloc Québécois will be out of the gates in pushing for something to show that they got something, that they're getting something, because that should be really important to them politically. But of course, they're in the same situation as everybody else right now. They can't force an election, but they can say the Bloc is standing up for this, and I think they probably will make some pretty strong demands probably tomorrow or the next day.
And so what do you think, do you think that the Liberals are going to have a tough time then in terms of not just forwarding their agenda, but also on these other issues that you talked about, demanding documents and committee meetings when the House returns? They're not going to have a majority on those. So really, do you think that this hands power back to the opposition and could in some way help Aaron O'Toole?
So, yeah, maybe I was mixing up some things there. I think that they're actually going to be okay for their agenda for the first little while. They've got I was saying I think the NDP is their natural partner. If Justin Trudeau wants to sort of say to the public, we're going back to governing. So it's pandemic, it's getting the child care agreements finalized, it's doing something to advance his climate change policies. All those are things that the NDP will have to work with the government on, or at least, deal with the government on, because those are the things their voters want too. So the NDP is going to be their natural partner. I think the Bloc Québécois less so. The Bloc Québécois is going to be less willing to cooperate with Justin Trudeau now. But I think the Liberals will have a pretty easy time getting through an agenda for the next 6 to 8 months. What I don't think they'll have is a pretty easy time managing Parliament and the issues of the things about calling ministers' aides to speak to a committee, questioning on this, that. It just won't be a simple ride in Parliament for the Liberal government. And we'll see how that turns in about a year.
Right. Why? Because you think that they could that we could be in another election, or like a leadership challenge for Mr. Trudeau? Like why a year?
Why a year? Because after a while, things start. It starts to be a lot harder to say this was the agenda that we presented, and we want you to work with us, and sort of the opposition starts building up its ways of needling you by having a committee investigation of this and so on. It gets a little more sort of contentious in Parliament. Justin Trudeau can't respond to that by saying, if you keep this up, we're going to call an election.
Right.
He can't do that anymore. He doesn't have that leverage anymore. And besides, there's a sign there that people like Justin Trudeau enough to give him 32% in the polls, but there's some sign there that people are starting to doubt Justin Trudeau's motives, and he has to sort of the Liberal Party has to worry whether he's going to be able to sort of turn that around in another election too. So he's got to be wary about, what if I get forced into an election? I can't force anyone else into election. I don't have the hammer to say,
right,
you guys don't like it, I'm going to an election.
Right. So what do you think, how do you think this changes his leadership? Are we going to see less of him and more of some of his team? Do you think that he'll kind of take a step back? Do you think that this was his last election?
I think it may well have been his last election. I don't know that. My experience is that prime ministers tend not to give up the job terribly easily. They stick around pretty much until they figure they can't anymore, as a rule. So I don't know. But I think that it doesn't get easier at this point for Justin Trudeau. 6 years in office, he's been everywhere. He is, I think, is the point you're alluding to, is that he's pretty well saturated the media markets over the last while. And after the 2019 election, I thought that there was a plan to sort of change that. If you look at a couple of months after they first got there, were brought down to a minority in 2019, Justin Trudeau wasn't around as much in those first couple of months. He was moving his ministers. He created political minister in Quebec, for example. He was moving ministers into positions like Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister, where she would be a spokesman for things that were, difficult day-to-day issues. And you sort of thought that may be a way for Justin Trudeau to stop being the center man on every single issue. And then, of course, the pandemic came, and that was no longer on. I wonder if he'll go back to that now. Certainly in Quebec, there'd been some effort during the campaign to have Mélanie Joly and Pablo Rodriguez speak out more and be more center stage, and that seemed to work a bit.
Right. So let's talk about the Conservatives. We saw some early reporting today that Mr. O'Toole might want to trigger the Reform Act in some way, kind of have a caucus vote about his leadership. I read that this morning. I don't know if I haven't confirmed that myself, but how do you think he goes about handling his caucus in these first few weeks after this election?
Yeah, that is obviously the big issue for him. And the answer is, I don't really know. I think triggering the Reform Act is a pretty high-risk maneuver. If you remember, I think the last time he did that was with Derek Sloan, the MP who was, I think the issue was that he had accepted a donation from somebody who was a white supremacist, and he claimed he didn't know. Anyway, right. Derek Sloan was a former leadership candidate, if you remember, and considered to be extreme by some people, and therefore they wanted him out of the party. Aaron O'Toole, used the Reform Act process to get him out, but it wasn't very popular within his own caucus, and I think he's going to have some trouble within his own caucus. You've been covered the Conservative Party before. You've seen what happened to Andrew Scheer. What do you think? It's going to be an easy ride after an election where he did not as well as Andrew Scheer?
I don't think it will. I think that the viewpoint of Conservatives is that this was a better campaign than Scheer's, just in terms of how it was run, and that he's a stronger candidate than Scheer. But I think it's also the proof is in the pudding, right? If the results are not as good or equal, then you don't get a lot of credit for that because you're a more likable character, or you're able to talk about gay rights and abortion without turning red and running away to hide. So I think he'll have some challenges, but then it's also sort of the Conservative Party doing this to themselves over and over again, where they're starting from scratch with a new leader and having to build up all the challenges that come with it, the public recognition, the trust. We saw how much O'Toole struggled with that in this election, of just people not knowing him, and then the Liberals trying to define him and kind of painting him as a wishy-washy man who doesn't believe in anything. And I think that the electorate to some degree believed that. So yeah, I mean, it's like it's going to be the challenge of do we try to build up from what we have, or do we start this all over again with the risk of potentially being in another election in a couple of years and having to go through this all over again, unless you get a high profile person that people know. And I think I'm curious to know what members think about the decision to choose Aaron O'Toole over someone like Peter MacKay, who did not win the leadership. In fact, did not win it by a lot. Like this was his to lose, and he lost it. So I just wonder if there's kind of a look for that next kind of big name in the Conservative movement and who that would be.
One of the things that kind of governs these issues too is that parties have their own cultures. So if you're talking about the Liberal Party, the calculus of how do we win next time, it always seems to be pretty high on the minds of the average Liberal voter. Not everyone, but they seem to sort of think about those things and talk about those things amongst themselves. But Conservatives can be a bit different. I remember talking to somebody in the last leadership campaign when Aaron O'Toole beat Peter MacKay, and they said to me, "You shouldn't be surprised that Conservatives would be picking the most conservative candidate." And at least they thought they were at the time. And I think the culture of, are they representing conservatism? Do they lead the conservative movement? That was something that Stephen Harper really brought into the party and solidified in the party. He wasn't really a firebrand prime minister. He was an incrementalist, Stephen Harper, but he represented a kind of conservative identity that the party felt comfortable with. And I'm not sure that they feel after this campaign like Aaron O'Toole fits them, very neatly. I think that might be part of the issue too. It's not always, will we win with Aaron O'Toole? I'm sure it would have been if he had a convincing result. But this one's kind of middle ground, isn't it?
Yes, and there's kind of an authenticity factor there, I think, too, that riles Conservatives when they don't feel that the person is being truly conservative. And of course, that's the struggle for the party is going the more mainstream route or appealing to the grassroots. And we see the challenges again exposed during a leadership process versus more of a broader election. And so I don't know that they won't face the same problems if they have another leadership race.
Surely somebody will emerge to say, we should have gone full conservative, and then we wouldn't have seen 5% of the vote go to the PPC.
Right. Yeah, and the PPC not came out of nowhere, but I think it was kind of a perfect storm of the pandemic and this libertarian viewpoint and kind of the I don't know that they would have had the same success had we not been in a pandemic, because they really, I think they tapped into something, albeit a fringe something, but people are, there's definitely a small minority of the population that is very seized with these issues and very upset, and they were able to harness that.
Yeah, the proof of that is that we had an election that was apparently just like this 2 years ago, except for the pandemic, and they didn't do as well. So clearly the pandemic helped the PPC.
Clearly, yes, I guess so. So we're just we're more than halfway through now. I just want to reintroduce what we're doing here in case we have new people who are joining. I'm Laura Stone, the Globe and Mail's Queen's Park reporter. I'm joined by Campbell Clark, the chief political writer for the Globe. We're chatting about the election results. We're talking about what happened and what the Liberal government has to look forward to or not look forward to in the coming months. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat and we'll get to them. So Campbell, what do you think? First of all, we don't have a press conference from Trudeau today. We will be hearing from Erin O'Toole later this afternoon. But do you think the Liberals take some time now, or do you think that they are going to be under pressure to call Parliament back and get back to work, seeing as they just went through this 5 to 6 week exercise that didn't really yield any concrete changes for them?
So I don't think they will be rushing to be in the public eye now. I think they will call Parliament back this fall, but I don't think anyone's going to be necessarily quibbling about what date in October that might be, or whether it's November 4th. So, and really, it's clearly in their interests to get out of the politicking business for a while, and to,
right.
You know, as Justin Trudeau acknowledged in that clip we saw off the top, people don't want to hear about that right now. So it's better for them to go away. And if they're going to talk about something, let it be about the pandemic or the economy. Erin O'Toole doesn't have that luxury, right? He's got to get out there and fight for his job today. He knows that. Andrew Scheer did that, didn't work, but he knows the campaign is on now. But
the Andrew Scheer saga kind of dragged on for longer than people may have thought. And it was, I call it a saga because really there was infighting. There was, you know, it was very publicly exposed within the Conservative movement. And I just wonder if you foresee kind of a similar public battle playing out for Erin O'Toole, and whether Erin O'Toole's leadership, and whether you think it would drag on in the same way that Scheer's did, if he'll hang on to the extent that we saw Mr. Scheer do back in 2019.
It's a good question. And I think if there really is a pitched battle, yes. I think that's what he was signaling last night. And right. I think that the reason both Andrew Scheer and Erin O'Toole signaled that on the first night was to try to ward off any challengers. You know, if you are going to take me on, you're going to have to fight for it. I think Erin O'Toole is probably in a strong enough position that he can fight for it with some hope of success. But, you know, it didn't seem Andrew Scheer had that much hope of success. Now with Erin O'Toole, it kind of depends, I think, on the way the caucus is turning. And right. At least he has a way of addressing them face to face.